When the 13th spade struck wet earth, the sound that rose from the hole was not the sound of soil, but of breath still trapped beneath it. The swamp held its silence for a long moment as though listening. Then it swallowed the noise as it always did. Between 1856 and 1859, 12 plantation owners vanished from the marshlands of northern Mississippi, men of money, power, and cruelty. Their estates were left in perfect order, meals half-eaten on dining tables, oil lamps still burning beside empty chairs, horses tethered but untended, papers signed and sealed awaiting the hand that would never return to finish them. No one saw them leave. No bodies were ever found. But those who worked the earth, those who dug the graves, said otherwise. They said one man had known where each of them had gone. A man named Solomon Gray, the Gravedigger. Court ledgers discovered in the Yazoo County archives record his name 27 times, each entry connected to the burial of someone else's dead. Yet not one of the 12 missing plantation owners had been officially placed beneath his spade. That was the part no one questioned, because Solomon was the man who buried the questions. He'd been born on the Langford Plantation in 1808, the child of an enslaved midwife, and a father he never saw except on Sundays, when the white men went hunting and the cabins filled with whispers. By 1842, he'd earned a reputation that crossed parish lines. No grave he dug ever flooded, no coffin ever rose, even when the river claimed the rest of the dead. They said Solomon knew the ground better than any man alive, that he could smell where water would come before it rained, that he could hear the difference between clay that would hold the dead and soil that would reject them. The masters trusted him. The enslaved respected him. The priests kept their distance. What no one realized was that Solomon kept count. Every name, every grave, every lash-marked body he placed into the cold dark. For 30 years he dug for others, until one night, when he decided that the next grave he opened would not wait for death to come first. Before we go further into Solomon's story, seal this truth within you. Comment the phrase, "The ground remembers," twice below, and let history's silence finally speak. And while you do, subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, because tonight we're digging through America's buried sins. The summer of 1856 settled heavy on the Delta like a fever that refused to break. The air itself felt diseased, sweet with decay, thick with the rot of things pretending to be alive. Flies hummed like a chorus of unseen priests over the riverbanks, blessing the dead with their endless hunger. That was the season Solomon began his quiet work. He was 48 then, an age that should have meant rest. But rest was a word that never belonged to men born in bondage or those raised beneath its echo. He still lived on the edge of the Langford property in a one-room shack that leaned like an old man praying toward the swamp. He kept his spade sharp, his silence sharper. The Langford family had used him for decades. Weddings, funerals, floods, Solomon dug through them all. To them, he was not a man. He was a tool that never wore out. They called him faithful, a word they used for hounds that obeyed and people who didn't matter. But Solomon had been listening, always listening. He knew where every beaten body had been buried and where every secret had been hidden. He knew which overseers broke bones for sport, which masters burned their names into human flesh, which men used God as an excuse to play devil. And when they came to him, trembling from fever or accident or duel, asking for graves, he'd nod and dig and whisper their names back into the dirt, as if the soil itself was writing its own record of vengeance. It wasn't rage that moved him. It was something slower, deeper, a patience carved out of centuries of waiting. For Solomon, justice had to be measured in the same way he measured graves 6 feet deep, wide enough to hold a man's sins, long enough to erase him from the world. The first to vanish was Edward Langford, heir to the plantation Solomon had served all his life. A man so cruel even the other planters kept their distance. They said he once whipped a child for crying too loudly at her mother's funeral, that he'd made Solomon dig his own mother's grave and fill it before the dirt was dry. When Edward went missing, no one asked Solomon what he knew. They never did. After all, who questions the man who buries the evidence? It was said that Edward Langford disappeared on a Sunday. Church bells had barely finished their echo when the servants noticed his absence. His horse returned at dusk, its saddle soaked in sweat, its eyes wild with the kind of terror that can't be explained. The animal refused to enter the yard, trembling and stamping as if the air itself had teeth. For 2 days, the estate searched the fields and swamps. Men shouted his name into the trees, dogs sniffed along the trails, lanterns bobbed like ghost lights through the mist. But the swamp gave nothing back. It never did. Solomon was there, silent as always, standing near the tree line with his spade resting against his shoulder. He watched them dig shallow pits in the wrong places, watched them call for a man who had already gone where voices couldn't follow. He didn't offer help, didn't offer words. He simply waited until the last search party left and the swamp went quiet again. That night, the lantern in Solomon's shack burned past midnight. Those who lived nearby claimed they saw him walking toward the water with something heavy slung across his shoulder, a bundle wrapped in canvas, dragging a thin red trail behind. No one spoke of it aloud, because in those parts, people learned that the swamp had a way of punishing curiosity. By morning, the earth behind his cabin looked disturbed. The ground was soft, freshly turned, though no one dared to ask why. The smell that drifted through the cypress trees was faint, metallic, almost sweet. Days later, Solomon returned to his usual work. Polite, obedient, he dug a grave for a white woman who had died of fever in town, humming the same hymn he always did, low, tuneless, ancient. When asked if he'd heard any news of his master, he only said, "The Lord calls all men in his time." And then he smiled, a thin, deliberate thing that didn't belong on any man's face. Whispers spread fast after that. Some said Solomon had gone mad. Others swore he had struck a deal with something that lived in the mud beneath the pines. But those who knew him best, those who'd watched their families lowered into the same soil he tended, they said something else entirely, that the ground had finally chosen to remember. The disappearance of Edward Langford should have been enough to shake the county, but it didn't. Men like him vanished all the time, riding off to gambling towns or drinking themselves into rivers that didn't forgive. The others called it misfortune. Solomon called it beginning. By autumn, the Langford estate passed into the hands of Edward's cousin, Charles Bellamy, a man slick with charm and swollen with arrogance. He spoke like the world owed him something and laughed at his own cruelty as if it were wit. The first thing he did as master was order the graves around the plantation tidied. Calling Solomon from his cabin, he wanted the dead rearranged. He said the sight of old tombstones disturbed the beauty of his property. "We'll put them behind the oaks," he said, "out of view. The dead don't mind, do they?" Solomon just nodded. He didn't speak. He began to dig. For 3 days, the sound of his shovel was the only music on the land. He moved earth the way an artist moves paint, careful, patient, deliberate. Bellamy watched for a time, sipping whiskey, then lost interest and left. He didn't see that each grave Solomon shifted became something else, each mound carefully shaped, each root unearthed like a signature. The man wasn't cleaning the past, he was rewriting it. On the 4th night, Bellamy followed the same path his cousin had. He rode out toward the swamp to inspect the fence lines. By dawn, his horse came back alone. This time, people were frightened. The overseers whispered prayers under their breath, and the field hands crossed themselves before sleep. The sheriff arrived, drank coffee with trembling hands, and told everyone to stay indoors until the search ended. But there was no search. Not really, because no one wanted to dig where Solomon had already dug. They said the swamp had turned traitor, that it lured white men into its heart and swallowed them whole. But deep down, every worker on that land knew whose hand had guided them there. They saw it in the calm way Solomon polished his spade at dusk, the faint smile beneath his breath when thunder rolled over the horizon. Justice, he thought, was a seed, and the soil had finally become rich enough to grow it. Winter came harsh and early that year, turning the Mississippi swamps into a mirror of black ice and silent fog. Even the birds seemed afraid to sing. Yet through the cold, Solomon worked without pause, digging, hauling, shaping the earth as though it were alive beneath his hands. He moved through the chill like a man immune to weather, or perhaps guided by something older than winter itself. By now, 2 plantation masters were gone. 2 men whose names had once been spoken with fear now whispered through the trees like curses undone. The neighboring estates started to take notice. Men armed themselves, keeping lanterns burning through the night. They blamed everything but the truth: escaped convicts, highwaymen, swamp fever, even witches. But none of them dared accuse Solomon, because what would that mean? To accuse the man who'd buried their fathers, their wives, their children, the man who could make a body disappear so completely even memory had to kneel before his silence. Still, something in the air had changed. The swamp had begun to hum. Those who ventured too close at night claimed to hear low chanting among the reeds. Solomon's voice, steady as a drumbit, reciting names to the dark. Names of men still breathing. Names that hadn't yet reached their graves. One evening a new master arrived. Dr. Silas Greaves, a physician turned landowner, who bought the neighboring Willowbend estate. He came to Solomon in a fine coat and gloves, pretending kindness, offering extra coin for special work. He said he wanted new graves prepared ahead of time, for the epidemic he feared would come with spring. Solomon listened, then asked, "How many graves, sir?" The doctor smiled, pulling a ledger from his pocket. "Start with 12. Solomon's eyes lifted slowly, meeting his for the first time. He nodded but said nothing. 12. The same number as the men who would vanish before this story ended. That night, he dug the first of them, wide, deep, lined with stones that seemed to whisper as they fell. Above the hole, the moon burned red through the fog, like a wound refusing to close. And when he finished, Solomon placed his palm over the grave's mouth and whispered softly, "Not for the fever, for the fire." The earth shuddered once, then stilled. By spring, the fever that Dr. Greaves had warned of never came. What came instead was something far quieter and far deadlier. A reckoning that moved in the dark, soundless except for the scrape of a spade and the breath of the man who wielded it. The first of the 12 graves Solomon had dug was filled before the season turned. It belonged to Dr. Greaves himself. The story spread in hushed tones across the county. The doctor had gone missing on a house call. His buggy found overturned near the bayou, his horse half mad and bleeding from the eyes. The sheriff said it was an accident. The church called it God's mystery. But the field hands said nothing. They'd seen the doctor's boots before, caked in mud that didn't belong to any road. They'd seen Solomon walking the next morning, his clothes damp with swamp water, his face calm as still air. After that, the disappearances came faster. 1 in April, 2 in May, 4 by June. Men who had built their fortunes on flesh and fire were now vanishing like smoke. Each time, the same pattern: no struggle, no sign, just the echo of a horse's panic and the soft churn of mud where something heavy had been dragged through. But Solomon never changed. He still came when called, burying those the fever did claim, whispering prayers the white priests refused to hear. His hands were steady, his eyes distant. The other workers had begun to call him Old Testament Solomon, the one who brought judgment instead of mercy. One night, a boy named Elijah, barely 12, followed him. The child had lost his mother to the lash and had watched Solomon bury her without a word. He wanted to know why the old man never cried. So he trailed him through the cypress and mist, keeping low until he saw Solomon stop beside a half-dug grave. The gravedigger knelt, pressing his palm into the earth. "She remembers," he whispered. Then he looked up, and his eyes met the boy's through the fog. "Go home," Solomon said softly. "You don't need to see how justice grows." Elijah ran, but he never forgot that voice. Years later, when the war ended and the plantations burned, he would tell anyone who listened that he'd seen where justice was planted, and that it had the shape of a man holding a spade. By midsummer, the county lived in fear. The planters no longer trusted the land that had once obeyed them. The swamp they'd stolen from the natives now seemed to whisper against them, its waters darker, its trees leaning closer, as if listening for their footsteps. Men who once ruled entire parishes now slept with guns beside their beds and lanterns burning till dawn. Yet no amount of fire could keep away what they could not see, or what they refused to name. Because by then, every man in those parts knew the pattern, knew who disappeared, knew who buried them. And though no one dared speak Solomon's name aloud, they all felt him in the silence between thunder and breath. Still, Solomon went about his work as he always had, unhurried, deliberate, faithful. He dug when called, nodded when spoken to, bowed his head when the masters passed. But at night, the swamp glowed faintly with lantern light, and his shadow could be seen moving between the trees, slow and precise, like a clock keeping perfect time. One night in July, the sheriff himself came to his cabin. The man was pale, sweating beneath his hat, his badge glinting like gilt in the firelight. "Solomon," he said, his voice trembling, "there's talk you might know something about these disappearances." Solomon didn't look up from the blade he was sharpening. The rhythmic sound of steel on stone filled the space between them. "Disappearances," he repeated softly. "Yes," the sheriff said. "Good men, landowners, folks that fed this county." Solomon smiled faintly then, just enough for the firelight to catch the edge of his teeth. "I reckon the earth feeds us all in the end," he murmured. The sheriff left not long after, his hands shaking too badly to light his pipe. That night the swamp was quieter than usual. The next morning, his horse was found near the bridge, riderless, reins torn, hoofprints ending at the edge of the water. By now the people had stopped asking questions. The masters' wives prayed in locked rooms. The field hands walked lighter, their backs a little straighter. For the first time in generations, fear had changed direction, and somewhere in the dark, Solomon whispered to the earth again. 12 graves, he said, one for each sin, and the ground remembers every one. By the time autumn returned, only a few of the great houses still stood untouched. The others were shuttered, their windows black, their porches sagging beneath the weight of silence. The plantations that had once echoed with cruelty now lay still, haunted not by ghosts, but by justice. Solomon had become a story whispered by candlelight. Children dared each other to say his name after sundown. The elders crossed themselves when thunder rolled, saying, "He's walking again." And walk he did. Every night, through fog and rain, through fields long abandoned, Solomon's steps were steady. He carried his lantern low, the light flickering across his face, revealing eyes that no longer seemed bound to this world. He dug in places no man had reason to dig, in the heart of the swamp, beneath cypress roots, along riverbanks where even the snakes refused to coil. But what he buried there wasn't just flesh. He buried memory, each grave a ledger entry, each shovelful a sentence passed. For Solomon understood something no law had ever written, that evil does not die on its own, it must be laid to rest, piece by piece, name by name. One night, a preacher named Amos Carter rode out to find him. The church could no longer ignore the whispers. They said the gravedigger had made a covenant with death, that he'd traded his soul to the mud for vengeance. Carter was a brave man or a foolish one. He found Solomon standing knee deep in a half-dug grave, his lantern glowing from below like a light swallowed by the earth. "Brother," the preacher called, "you can't fight the Lord's justice with your own hands." Solomon didn't stop digging. His voice came low and calm. "The Lord made these hands," he said, "just waited for me to use them right." The preacher turned pale. He wanted to argue, but words fled him. The air itself seemed to close around them, heavy and wet, smelling of copper and rain. Then Solomon looked up, and for a heartbeat the preacher swore he saw faces in the fog, men's faces, pale and open-eyed, rising from the ground before sinking again. Carter fled that night and never preached again. He said the earth had spoken back, and it had used Solomon's voice to do it. By the winter of 1859, the land itself seemed cursed. Crops withered in the fields, wells ran sour, and cattle refused to drink from the streams that wound through the marshes. The remaining planters packed their ledgers and fled north, leaving their homes to rot under creeping vines and the weight of their own sins. What they left behind was a silence so heavy it bent the trees. Only Solomon stayed. He lived alone now, if you could call it living. His cabin leaned further each year, its walls stitched with moss, its floor lined with candles melted down to nubs. On the table sat 12 silver buttons, a ring, a pair of spectacles, and a pocket watch that hadn't ticked in months. Each one belonged to a man whose name the county no longer spoke. Each one a reminder that the ground had been paid in full. Some said he was cursed, others said he was chosen, but the truth was simpler. Solomon had become what the world had made him, a reflection of every cruelty he'd buried. His face, once calm, had hardened like carved wood. His hands trembled not from age, but from the memory of how easily the earth had opened for him. One night, a great storm swept through Yazoo County. Wind tore roofs from houses, lightning split oaks, and the river rose high enough to swallow the road. They said it was the worst storm in 50 years. But when it passed, the strangest thing happened. Every one of the 12 graves Solomon had dug had risen. The earth cracked open as if exhaling. By dawn, the townsfolk gathered near the swamp's edge. The graves were empty, no bones, no coffins, just hollows filled with dark water that shimmered like glass. And at the center of it all, Solomon's cabin stood quiet. Door open, lanterns still burning, spade leaning against the wall. But he was gone. No footprints, no sign of struggle. Just one thing written into the mud outside his door, carved deep with the end of his shovel. The ground remembers. After that night, no one spoke his name again. The swamp reclaimed his home, his tools, and his story. Only the wind carried whispers of a man who served every master until the earth itself made him its own. Years passed. The war came and went, leaving behind smoke, ruin, and freedom that tasted more like hunger than hope. The plantations fell, their grand columns cracked and split, their fields surrendered to weeds. But the swamp remained, the same breathless labyrinth of fog and shadow where Solomon had walked. Those who dared to wander near it after dark swore the air still carried his hymn, low and steady like a shovel scraping against eternity. By 1871, the land had changed hands again. Carpetbaggers and speculators arrived from the north, chasing profit where old blood had soaked the soil. One such man, Henry Callaway, bought the old Langford estate. He built a new house atop the ruins, ignoring the warnings of those who remembered. When asked about the graves, he laughed and said, "Dead men don't own dirt." On his first night in the house, a storm rolled in from the river. The rain came sideways, drumming against the windows like fists. Callaway lit a cigar, poured himself a drink, and told his servants to keep the lamps bright. But sometime after midnight, the wind went still. The lamps flickered out one by one. Then came the sound, a slow, rhythmic scraping just beneath the floorboards. He thought it was rats, until he heard the hum, that old, tuneless hum, the one the elders used to whisper about, the sound of a spade turning earth that no longer needed turning. When the storm broke at dawn, the servants found the master's chair overturned, his drink spilled, and the floor split wide beneath his feet. The boards had buckled upward from below, as though something had pushed its way through. Callaway was gone. Only his boots remained, half sunk into the mud that had risen from the ground itself. The sheriff came, took notes, and left before sunset. No report was filed. No body was ever found. The house was abandoned within a week. To this day, the swamp still breathes in the summer heat, and locals say if you stand quiet enough, you can hear it whisper beneath your feet. Some say it's the wind. Others say it's the dead remembering. But the elders, the ones who know the story, say it's Solomon still working, digging, judging, waiting for the ground to call another name. By the turn of the century, Solomon Gray had become a legend. A curse parents whispered to restless children. A warning told around fire pits when the nights grew too quiet. Don't walk the swamps after sundown. They'd say, for the gravedigger still walks them, and he don't care if your skin's white or black, only if your soul's clean. But time, like the river, wears down even the hardest truths. By 1902, the story of Solomon was little more than folklore. Preachers called it superstition. Scholars called it metaphor. They said the disappearances of 1856-59 were the work of disease, floods, or runaways. No one wanted to believe a single man could make the earth turn against its masters. Then came the digging. In the summer of 1904, a team of railroad men began clearing the marshlands to lay new track. Their foreman, a man named William Darnell, wrote in his logbook that they'd struck a series of sinkholes. But they weren't sinkholes. They were graves. 12 of them perfectly measured, perfectly aligned, empty. The men kept working until one night the youngest laborer vanished. They found his hat the next morning beside a hole that hadn't been there the day before. Fresh dirt, shovel marks. The crew refused to go back. Darnell fired them all, brought in new men, and swore he'd finish the job himself. But 3 nights later, his body was found lying face down in the mud, his hands clenched around a rusted iron spade. When the sheriff inspected it, he noticed something carved into the handle, so faint it could have been mistaken for scratches. It read, "For every sin, a shovel's length." After that, the company abandoned the project. They rerouted the tracks miles away, leaving that stretch of swamp untouched. And from that year on, no map ever showed the land where the Langford plantation once stood. But the people of Yazoo County still knew. They still left offerings at the edge of the cypress, bits of cloth, candles, coins, and sometimes just a handful of dirt. They said it wasn't worship, it was respect, because some debts, they whispered, can't be paid in money or blood. They can only be paid in silence, and Solomon had already collected. Decades passed, and the world moved on. The swamps grew thicker, swallowing the last traces of the old plantations. The Civil War became memory, and memory became myth. But in Mississippi, some things refused to stay buried. In 1938, a young journalist from Jackson named Ruth Hollis arrived in Yazoo County chasing a ghost story. She'd heard whispers of the faithful Gravedigger, a man who'd served his masters for 30 years, and then buried every one of them. Her editor called it nonsense, a Negro folk tale. But Ruth wanted truth, not dismissal. She was the kind who believed every legend started with a fact someone was too afraid to print. She found the old people first, men and women in their 80s and 90s who'd lived long enough to remember the names Langford, Bellamy, Greaves. They told her the same story, each time with the same tremor in their voice. He wasn't a killer, miss. He was a keeper. He kept what the earth couldn't stomach no more. Ruth filled her notebook with their words, but what drew her most was a single phrase that kept returning. The ground remembers. Every elder said it, almost like a prayer. Determined to find proof, she hired 2 local boys and rode out to the old Langford land. It was nearly impassable. Roots twisted over what used to be roads, the air thick with the hum of unseen things. After hours of hacking through brush, they found it the remains of a cabin, half sunk, the door rotted off, a rusted lantern still hanging by the frame. Inside, Ruth found a table warped by time. On it lay a small bundle wrapped in burlap. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside were 12 silver buttons, a ring, a pair of spectacles, and a cracked pocket watch. Its hands frozen at midnight. That night, back at her boarding house, she wrote in her journal, "The swamp is not empty. It breathes. It feels watched. The stories are not stories. They are warnings. I think I heard digging. God help me, I think I heard digging." Her editor never received the article. Ruth Hollis was last seen boarding a boat toward the swamp 2 days later. The boat drifted back at dawn, empty. By the time the search party found Ruth's notebook, it was half buried in silt, the pages soft and spotted with water stains. Most of it was unreadable, the ink washed away like confession under rain. But a few lines remained, enough to make the sheriff close the book and burn it without a word. "The swamp hums at night. It sounds like a man breathing beneath the water. I saw light between the cypress. Lanterns moving, but no hands to carry them. He's not gone. He's working." After Ruth vanished, Yazoo County went silent again. The state called it an accident, said she'd fallen from the boat or been taken by alligators. But the locals knew better. No one ever drowned that deep in calm water. The swamp had claimed her, same as it had claimed the men she came to write about. For years, people stayed away. The land became a no-man's stretch between farms and the river, a place maps marked only with the word impassable. But the stories didn't stop. Hunters told of finding old tools in the mud, spades and picks rusted beyond recognition, some with the handles carved full of names. Fishermen swore that if you stayed too long after sunset, the water grew warm and the ground beneath your feet started to breathe. In 1951, a fire swept through the edges of Yazoo. Flames burned everything in their path, except one place, the swamp. When the wind changed, the fire bent around it, splitting in two, as though the air itself refused to touch that soil. The locals took it as proof. The ground that remembered could not be burned. Old Elijah, the boy who once saw Solomon dig, lived long enough to see that fire. He was near 90, blind in one eye, and dying in his bed when a young preacher came to give him last rites. "Elijah," the preacher whispered, "do you believe the gravedigger's still there?" The old man smiled faintly, eyes milky with age. "Still there," he murmured. "No, son, he is there. The land ain't never stopped working. Every sin feeds the roots, and every night he keeps count." Then he laughed, A dry, tired sound. The ground remembers, preacher. It always did. In the decades that followed Elijah's death, Solomon's story became more than a rumor. It became a warning. Parents whispered it to their children on storm nights, when thunder rolled low across the delta and lightning cracked through the cypress like a whip. "Don't go near that water," they'd say. "The gravedigger still walks when it rains." But there was something deeper beneath the superstition, something that refused to die with the old generation. In the 1970s, when a construction company tried to dredge the swamp to lay an oil pipeline, every machine that entered the water broke within days. Engines seized without reason. Metal corroded overnight. 2 workers went missing in separate incidents. Both last seen near the same patch of trees where the old cemetery was said to lie. Search teams found nothing but a line of freshly disturbed earth, soft as though it had been dug the night before. The project was abandoned within the year. The company's report cited unstable ground conditions. The locals called it Solomon's refusal. Yet the swamp did not sleep. In 1994, a state geologist named Howard Pennington conducted soil tests in the region. His instruments picked up irregular cavities beneath the surface, rectangular, human-sized. He recorded 12 distinct voids, 12 each lined in the same formation as a grave. He noted in his logbook depth consistent with mid-19th century burials, no markers, unexplained preservation. 2 days later, his camp flooded under clear skies. His notes were destroyed. Pennington himself survived, but he refused to return, saying only, "The ground isn't empty there. It breathes. Even now the swamp holds its secrets." At dusk, when the fog creeps low and the cicadas fall silent, some say you can hear it, the faint, deliberate rhythm of a shovel biting into wet earth. 12 times, then pause, 12 more, the same slow heartbeat of revenge that started nearly 2 centuries ago. And sometimes, just before dawn, when the mist thins, people claim to see him, a tall figure standing ankle deep in the mire, hat-brim, low face in shadow. Beside him, the ground shivers, as if waiting for its next breath. They say Solomon isn't a ghost, he's a promise, a debt made flesh. The gravedigger who buried 12 men alive, and who never stopped counting. Time has done what time always does. It buried the bodies, the records, and the truth under moss and myth. But some things time cannot touch. It cannot unmake the sound of a shovel in mud. It cannot silence the story of a man who served his masters faithfully until the day he decided to serve them to the earth instead. Today, the locals don't speak his name above a whisper. They call him the Faithful One, or simply the Keeper. Hunters who lose their way in the Yazoo backwater tell of seeing a lantern swaying through the fog, steady, patient, and unbothered by wind. Those who follow it say it never moves fast, only far enough to draw you deeper. Then, when the light flickers out, the silence comes, thick as the grave. In 2003, a group of paranormal researchers from Baton Rouge came to film a documentary about the legend. They never released the footage publicly, but one of the assistants leaked an audio recording years later. It's faint, full of static, but just before the tape ends, a man's voice can be heard whispering, "We didn't dig this hole, it's already open." No one could explain the origin of the voice. The team disbanded soon after, each claiming nightmares of being buried alive. One of them, in an interview years later, said something that still chills those who study the case. "You can feel him. Not watching, working. Like he's still tending to something, still finishing what he started." The swamp itself has become a kind of living tomb, roots tangled like veins, water still as glass. And at its heart, 12 mounds rise just high enough to break the surface when the moon is low. They say if you count them aloud, the 13th appears, a fresh one, waiting. Perhaps Solomon Langford was never meant to rest. Perhaps men like him, men who carried the weight of injustice so deep in their bones it changed the ground they walked on, don't die. They turn into the land, into something that remembers. So if you ever find yourself driving through Yazoo County on a quiet night and your headlights catch the glint of water between the trees, don't stop. Don't listen when you hear the soft sound of iron against earth. And above all, don't answer if someone in the dark asks, "Would you like a place to rest?" Because out there, in the swamp where history refuses to die, the faithful gravedigger still keeps watch, and the ground still remembers every name he ever buried. Years later, long after the last eyewitnesses had passed, and the swamp had reclaimed the ruins of Bellwood and Langford estates, a drought came. It was the summer of 2011, Mississippi's driest season in over a century. The Yazoo swamps cracked and shrank, their waters pulling back to reveal what had long been hidden. A team from the University of Southern Mississippi arrived to study the environmental effects of the drought. They expected mud fossils, maybe remnants of old farming tools. What they found instead stopped them cold. Near the coordinates once marked, Langford tract, the ground had split open to reveal the outlines of 13 perfect rectangles, graves, each about 6 feet long, each lined with stones old and blackened by age. At the center of the formation lay an iron spade, its handle missing, its blade half buried in clay. A symbol carved into the metal, 2 interlocking letters, SL. The team took photographs. They sent soil samples to Jackson for testing. The report came back strange: no decomposition gases, no human remains, no trace of coffin wood. Yet the soil itself was rich with calcium and iron, the kind found in the human body after decades of breakdown. It was as if the dead had melted into the earth completely, leaving behind only memory in molecular form. When news broke, locals warned the researchers to leave it be. "Don't stir the keeper," one old farmer said. "He done his work, let him sleep." But curiosity rarely listens to caution. That night, motion sensors around the dig site recorded vibrations at precisely 2:13 a.m., a rhythmic, metallic scraping sound, 12 beats, a pause, 12 more, then silence. By morning, the equipment was gone. Cameras crushed, tripods twisted. The spade, the one marked SL, was missing. Only the holes where it had stood remained, wet and steaming under the sun. The research team packed up within hours. Their report was filed, then sealed by the university, citing spiritual and cultural sensitivity. None of them ever returned to Yazoo. Today, locals say the graves have sunk again beneath the water, and the swamp has grown darker than before. Some claim the lantern light still flickers at the edges, like a pulse. Others believe it's just methane or swamp gas. But the elders don't argue science. They only shake their heads and say, "That ground ain't empty. It remembers who laid it right." And somewhere beneath that still black water, the faithful gravedigger digs on, steady, patient, eternal. The servant who buried his masters. The man who turned vengeance into soil. And the earth that still breathes his name. More than a century and a half later, the legend of the faithful gravedigger, or faithful diner, as the tale was first whispered, continues to drift through southern air like the echo of a sermon no one dares finish. Every generation seems to find its way back to that cursed patch of Yazoo earth, each trying to dig for truth, and each leaving with less than they came with. Historians debate whether Solomon Langford or Dinah ever existed. Some say the names were changed over time, mixed between plantation records and oral stories, until 2 souls became one myth. Others believe the legend hides a collective truth, the rage of hundreds of enslaved men and women whose pain the soil itself absorbed. What no one denies is the evidence that remains. Every attempt to build, dig, or drain that swamp has ended in failure. Instruments malfunction, batteries die, GPS coordinates reset themselves to 0. Even satellite imagery shows distortions over the same patch of land, as though the earth refuses to be mapped. In 2019, a local documentarian named Julian Price attempted to shoot a short film titled "The Ground Remembers." He spent weeks interviewing families whose ancestors lived near Bellwood and Langford estates. One of them, an elderly woman named Ora May, brought out a wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside lay a rusted button, a tarnished spoon, and a single silver locket engraved with the initials SL. Inside the locket was a faded photograph, not of a man, but of a woman in a servant's bonnet. Ora May said her great-grandmother called her Dinah. The film was never completed. Price went missing 3 months later while scouting the swamp at night. His camera was found upright in the mud, still recording. The footage is short, only 17 seconds long, but the sound engineer who analyzed it swore there was something buried beneath the static. A voice, slow, rhythmic, counting. 1, 2, 3. The clip ends abruptly with the sound of water rushing over the mic. Whether the faithful gravedigger was Solomon Dinah, or something older than both, something born from centuries of blood and silence, no one knows. But in Yazoo County, when the air grows thick and the ground softens beneath your boots, people still whisper, "Be kind to the soil. It's seen too much." Because some histories aren't written in books. They're written in the dirt. And sometimes the dirt remembers louder than the living. Even today, those who dare enter the Yazoo swamps report an unease that can't be measured by logic. Hunters, geologists, and thrill seekers all describe the same phenomenon. The ground seems to shift underfoot, uneven but deliberate, as if someone, or something, has been rearranging it while no one watches. Some say it's just waterlogged soil, but the older residents call it the heartbeat of the keeper, a pulse that traces its rhythm across centuries. In 2022, a team of amateur historians and urban explorers attempted to map the old plantation boundaries using drones. They expected decayed foundations, perhaps some rusted tools. Instead, they discovered an unbroken line of earthworks, straight as a ruler and aligned with an old creek that no longer flows. Each mound rose unnaturally from the swamp, forming an almost perfect grid. The software they used failed to record data beyond the edges of these mounds. Screens glitched, drones faltered mid-flight, as if the landscape itself refused to be captured digitally. By nightfall, the team had split into smaller groups, each wandering through fog so dense it turned their flashlights into nothing but halos. One member swore he heard the faint scrape of a spade against soil, slow, precise, deliberate. He called out, "Silence." Then it came again, 12 scrapes, pause, 12 more. A rhythm he felt in his chest rather than heard. The group reconvened near the creek. One of them, a young woman named Leona, had vanished. The others found her boots at the edge of a mound, the earth beneath them freshly disturbed. No struggle, no footprints leading away, only the impression of soil compressed, as if someone had pressed her into the ground itself. They fled, leaving cameras, drones, and notebooks behind. In the weeks afterward, local authorities refused to search for Leona. They cited difficult terrain and lack of evidence, but residents knew the truth: the swamp doesn't give up what it has claimed. Some argue the faithful gravedigger is no longer a man or woman. It is a system, a force, a manifestation of centuries of repressed pain and revenge. Every tree, root, and mound acts as a sentinel. Every ripple in the water, every soft thud in the mud is a message the keeper remembers. Even now, if you drive past Yazoo County at night, past cypress knees jutting like teeth into the fog, you might see a figure moving slowly through the mist, hat brim low, spade in hand. And if you listen closely, you will hear it, the rhythmic scraping of earth, the slow, inevitable marking of debt repaid. The people who live near the edges of the Yazoo swamps have learned to respect it, to fear it in a quiet, constant way. They speak in low voices about the places where the water runs black and the moss hangs thick. They tell stories to children about shadows that move without light and footsteps that leave no trace. Some claim these tales are nothing more than folklore, but those who have wandered too far into the cypress know better. In 2025, a documentary crew arrived, intent on capturing proof of the faithful gravedigger. They brought high-resolution cameras, infrared sensors, and even ground-penetrating radar. Their first night, as fog rolled in from the swamp, something extraordinary happened. The readings on every device began to fail simultaneously. Temperatures plunged, electronic interference spiked, and every GPS signal disappeared. The crew reported seeing faint lights dancing over the water, lanterns held by unseen hands. When they tried to move closer, the ground beneath them shifted, sinking in impossible ways, as if the swamp itself were alive and deliberately moving them along its paths. One member, a young researcher named Calvin, documented the experience in a voice memo later recovered from a damaged recorder. "I saw a figure tall, thin, wearing what looked like a broad-brimmed hat. He moved methodically, digging, or at least striking the earth. 12 movements, pause, 12 more. It was as if he was counting, and I could feel the weight of him in my chest, like my own heartbeat had synchronized with the digging. I can't explain it. He's not just a story." But dawn, the crew fled the swamp. Their equipment was left behind, some of it buried in mud, some found later floating downstream, twisted or destroyed. No one returned to the site. Locals now speak of the faithful gravedigger less as a person and more as a warning, a force entwined with the land itself. The swamp holds memory, and memory holds power. Every misdeed, Every injustice committed by those long dead feeds the earth, and in return the earth watches and waits. Some nights, when the wind is right and the mist sits low on the water, people swear they can hear the scraping of a spade, slow and rhythmic, marking the passage of a justice older than the nation itself. 12 scrapes, pause, 12 more. And if you stop to listen, the ground seems to breathe, as though the keeper is reminding the living of debts that will not be forgotten. And so we arrive at the final truth the swamp has been whispering for nearly 2 centuries, the faithful gravedigger. Solomon Langford, diner, or whatever name the soil chooses to remember, is not bound by flesh or time. He is the embodiment of retribution, an arbiter of a justice the living cannot administer. Every footprint he left behind has long since disappeared, every face remembered only in stories whispered between cypress knees and Spanish moss, yet the weight of his deeds remains. The 12 men he buried alive, once masters of plantations, now serve as a grim ledger etched into the earth itself. Their cruelty, their arrogance, their lives lived as instruments of oppression, all accounted for by hands that knew patience, precision, and the inevitability of consequence. Each grave was a ritual, each burial a judgment executed without haste, without error. And the land itself took note, recording every name, every action, every act of human depravity. Locals swear that if you walk through the Yazoo swamps alone after midnight, you can feel his presence. A shadow between shadows, moving silently along the old ditches and mounds, pausing at places where injustice once thrived. The air grows heavy, the ground softens, and the faint sound of earth being shifted reaches your ears. The slow, deliberate cadence of a spade striking soil. 12 strikes, pause, 12 more, and with each rhythm you feel the history pressing against you, reminding you that the past is never truly gone. Some believe that the faithful gravedigger is still adding to his ledger, still measuring, still tending the graves that no one else can see. Others claim he has become one with the swamp itself, a presence that lives in the roots, the water and the wind. He is both warning and guardian, a reminder that oppression leaves traces that neither time nor decay can erase. If you find yourself near Yazoo County and you hear the soft scrape of a shovel in the mud, do not look down, do not call out. The keeper sees all, and the swamp protects its own. This is a place where history is alive, breathing and patient. A place where justice waits, measured in footsteps and spade strikes, invisible to the world, but unmistakable to those who know to listen. And as the moonlight shifts across the black water, remember this: the faithful gravedigger does not forget. He counts, he measures, he buries, and the earth remembers every name, every crime, every debt. The swamp keeps its own records, and in its silence, it speaks louder than any court, any historian, or any book. Tread lightly, the keeper is patient, and he is still working.